grading is clear, where everything is on Angel is clear. Okay. If something becomes unclear as we go, please let me know. Because I absolutely want you to have all the resources that I can give you to help you with the hard stuff here. Okay, so we start in this second semester, really as kind of a continuation of the nervous system. So, hold on, somebody just came in. Let me mark you as here. All right. So the nervous system, as you learned, is, command and control, basically. As conscious and sentient things. We tend to think of the nervous system, we think of the brain, and all the fancy brain stuff that we can do. Imagination, creativity, problem solving, that kind of thing. But in the autonomic system, as we talked about, the brain is also in real-time control of lots of different aspects of the body's physiology. Now, it's not the same thing as moving your arms and legs around. It's not like the brain tells the heart to contract every time it does. The brain doesn't control what the liver does. But the brain plays a major role in managing those organs and what they're doing to maintain homeostasis. Because there's no part of the body that knows as much about what's going on, both in the external environment and the internal environment, as the brain. So in many ways, the endocrine system is an extension of the brain's command and control over the rest of the body. Okay? So, in the nervous system, we saw that through action potential transduction, the movement of charge from one end of the cell to another, caused the release of a neurotransmitter. That neurotransmitter crossed that little gap called the synapse and then affected the next neuron in the chain, either stimulating it or inhibiting it. Well, the endocrine system works with chemical messengers, just like neurotransmitters, but instead of pushing those neurotransmitters across the synapse, they're released into the bloodstream instead, or they're released into the fluid that surrounds the cells in a tissue or in an organ, right? So the nervous system is also a chemical messaging system, but it uses axons and dendrites to carry the signal the distance, and then the signal is sent at the end. For the endocrine system, the signal is put into the bloodstream. It goes all around the whole body, but only affects those cells that have receptors for that signal or that chemical messenger. All right? So those chemical messengers can do all kinds of different things, as we'll see both in this chapter, and we're going to talk about hormones in practically every other chapter that we cover this semester too. But we introduce the concept here. All right, so ultimately, cells can talk to each other in 4 different ways. Okay, and some of these you've heard about already. First is direct communication. Some cells can talk to their neighbors by sending chemical signals from cytoplasm to cytoplasm. Okay, when you talked about endothelial tissue last semester, you might have covered this. All right, so one of the ways that cells are attached to each other. Okay, so this is a cell. This is a cell. By the way, in case you didn't notice from last semester, my handwriting is really bad sometimes. If you can't read something, please raise your hand and say, Dr. Pete, what does that say? And I will translate it for you, okay? I'm not writing on the board for me, I'm writing on there for you. So if you can't read it, that's my fault, but let me know. Okay, so we got 2 cells, cell membranes, right? Well, one of the types of cell junctions essentially looks like a drinking straw, a little short drinking straw. It's hollow on the inside. We call these gap junctions, right? So gap junctions. And we call them that because they form a gap between 2 cells. So essentially, inside this gap junction, the cell membrane isn't there. So it means that stuff can go into this tube, through the tube, and into the next cell. So we call that direct communication between cells. One place we see this, for example, is in smooth muscle. In skeletal muscle, you have these great big huge cells, very, very long, that contract as one cell. In smooth muscle, we have lots of different cells that are all connected together, and they all have to contract at the same time. So one place we see gap junctions happening is calcium from one cell goes through the gap junction and then goes to its neighbor and causes the neighbor to contract when this one is contracting. Okay, so we'll see gap junctions and some of the roles they play in the digestive system and in the cardiac system, because this is how the heart works too. Calcium goes from one cardiac cell to the next, causes the whole heart to contract at once, which is a good idea. Okay, so typically the messengers going through those tiny junctions are very, very small molecules. So ions, maybe some teeny tiny peptides, little pieces of proteins, and then things that are lipid soluble can pass from cell to cell without going through a gap junction. Because remember, lipid soluble things can pass through cell membranes, right? Because they're fatty and cell membranes are fatty. We'll see some other examples of that later. Okay, so that's the first way. The second way is cells can talk to their neighbors. So cells, you remember, live in this fluid that we call interstitial fluid. So interstitial fluid is outside of cell membranes and outside of the vessels too. So it's not blood and it's not cytoplasm or cellular fluid. It's outside of that. Well, cells can release chemical messengers into that interstitial fluid, and the messengers diffuse to the neighbor cells and can affect those cells. We call that paracrine communication. And it's one of the ways, in addition to direct communication, that tissues work together. You know, a tissue is a group of cells all performing the same task in the same place, right? That's a tissue. So paracrine communication allows for coordination between cells and their neighbors. All right. The third way is what we're going to spend this whole chapter talking about, and that's endocrine communication. By definition, an endocrine communication is a cell releases a messenger into the bloodstream. The bloodstream, constantly moving because of the heart, then transmits that chemical message to all cells of the body. Now, that doesn't mean that all cells of the body are going to respond. Only cells that have a receptor for that messenger are going to respond. Okay? So it's a little bit like the internet in some ways. You know, you do something on the internet and your traffic gets merged with traffic from all your neighbors and, you know, half the city. But your traffic only goes to the place where it's destined. It's a similar system for the endocrine system. You know, only cells that have receptors are actually affected. All right. And then the fourth way is one you know all kinds of things about already, and that's synaptic communication. And this is where messages are sent across a narrow gap between cells here in response to an action potential causing neurotransmitter to be released, as you learned, I'm assuming, lots about last semester, right? So that's it. There's only 4 ways that cells can communicate with each other. So this is going to be our focus in this chapter. We'll hear a little bit about paracrine communication in some other places. We'll talk quite a bit about it in the cardiac system, and then, of course, you've already done the nervous system. All right. So if those are the messaging systems, well, what are the messengers? Well, the messengers for the hormone, for the endocrine system, are one of these 3 types of molecules. Here, let me turn that down, or it's going to keep squeaking at me. There. Okay. So the first big group are the amino acid derivatives, which get their name, not surprisingly, because they start their life as amino acids, and then they get modified to their final form, which has an effect on cells. And in many ways, these are some of the hormones you hear the most about. Okay, so in this class of amino acid derivatives are the thyroid hormones. As we'll see, thyroid hormone controls the body's metabolism. How rapidly do we use energy? How carefully do we store energy is often the thyroid hormone's role. It starts its life as an amino acid. And then it's modified, gets some things added to form this structure. Now, in my class, this is not a chemistry class. So unless I specifically tell you otherwise, chemical structures are not testable things, okay? The only reason I want you to even look at these is some of you have had some organic chemistry or some chemistry. You recognize some of these functional groups, right? But in no way am I going to ask you to draw out thyroxine. I couldn't do it, so I wouldn't ask you to do it. So the only exceptions to that will be in the metabolism chapter, but I'm going to tell you what those exceptions are. So they're just there as visuals. This is thyroid hormone with its complicated structure. Okay. Another amino acid derivative set are the catecholamines. The catecholamines are basically a set of hormones, and two of them are famous, and you've heard about them already, and that's epinephrine and norepinephrine. So epi and norepi, as those who know them call them, are the catechols, right? Technically, the catecholamines. So if you happen to see a question on an exam or homework that talks about catecholamines, what we're talking about is either epinephrine or norepinephrine. And that name just describes their chemical structure, okay? But that's not important. Just know the two, epi and norepi. And then the last one of any note, anyway, is is melatonin. Not to be confused with melanin, okay? Melanin gives skin its color, and it's part of our built-in sunscreen system, right? You should have learned about melanin when you learned about skin. Melatonin comes from a particular part of the brain called the pineal gland, and its role is largely unknown in the human being anyway. We know it has effects on the sleep-wake cycle. So in some people, if you take melatonin, which you can buy over the counter, it makes you very, very sleepy. It acts as a sleep aid. But it doesn't work on everybody, which shows you that we don't really know what melatonin does. But we know it does that. In animals, melatonin plays a big role in timing reproduction. So like cows on a farm have a tendency to give birth all at the same time, within the same couple of weeks. And all kinds of animals do that. They have their offspring at the same time every year. We know that melatonin plays a role in that in those animals, but we don't think it plays that same kind of role in us. But melatonin is a mystery in many ways. But it's an amino acid derivative. It comes from tryptophan. One of the theories behind the post-Thanksgiving dinner, big turkey dinner sleepiness is that the tryptophan, which there's a lot of that in turkey, gets modified into melatonin, and then melatonin makes you sleepy. Now, it may also just be that you've just put a huge load in your digestive tract, and your body has that to deal with now. But it's a theory. Okay, so those are the amino acid derivatives. The next group are the peptide hormones. Remember, a peptide is another name for a protein. Now, in everyday biochemical speak, we use the word protein to describe a very large peptide. Hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of base pairs long. When we use the word peptide, we're usually talking about a much smaller number of bases, okay? Or not bases, amino acids tied together. So there are some really important examples in this peptide hormone group. So, for example, peptide hormones, ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone, is one of those. Oxytocin is another one. I know you haven't heard about those two yet, but you will. And then the hormones from the pancreas, like insulin and growth hormone. And then we also have prolactin is a peptide hormone, and I like this statement right here. This hormone group, it describes all of the hormones from the hypothalamus, the heart, the thymus, the digestive tract, and the pancreas. So wow, that's a lot of hormones, as you'll see as we make our way through the course. So there are a wide variety of these peptide hormones. And that kind of makes sense because one of the cool things about proteins and how they're built, like you learned about last semester, is you have this group of amino acids that you can put together in an infinite number of ways, right? So it means that in peptides, you can have a wide variety of molecules, each that responds very differently because they're each unique, right? So even though like the prolactin and insulin are both made of the same stuff, because the order is different, the body can see that they're different and respond differently to them. All right, so that's the peptide hormone group. Lots of examples in there. Now, these top two, amino acid derivatives and peptide hormones, they are both water soluble. which means it's easy to move them around in the body because the body is mostly water. But it's hard for them to get inside of cells. Things that are water-soluble get repelled by the lipid in the cell membrane, which means that these top two need receptors on the surface of cells. Did you talk about receptors at all last semester? Yes? Okay, good, because we're going to talk in more detail about them in a minute. So essentially, here's a cell, and here's a molecule. Well, in order for this water-soluble molecule to have any effect on the inside of this cell, there needs to be an antenna of sorts. There has to be a way for this to connect to the outside of the cell and then make something happen on the inside of the cell. Okay, so these top two, the receptors, are found on the outsides of cells because that's where the hormone is. So you have to put the receptor where the hormone is, and that is circulating through the blood. Okay, then the last big group down here are the lipid derivatives. So they start their lives as fats of some kind. And there are two big groups. There are the eicosanoids. That's how you say that word, eicosanoids. And there are the steroid hormones, which everybody has heard of those. Well, eicosanoids and steroid hormones both begin their lives as cholesterol. So cholesterol gets a bad rap sometimes because, you hear in the media that, oh, we should get rid of cholesterol in our diets. Well, you need a little, because cholesterol is the starting point for a whole bunch of important compounds in the body. These are just examples of two of them, okay? So the eicosanoids and the steroid hormones, they are both lipid soluble because they start as fats. Now, why is that important? It means they can pass through cell membranes and get directly into the nucleus of the cell without a receptor on the outside. Because, you've got a cell membrane, and then you've got a nuclear membrane, right? They're made of the same stuff, though. So if a substance can pass through the cell membrane, it'll pass through the nuclear membrane, too. So these hormones, these chemical messengers, their receptors are usually found in the nucleus, or at least on the inside of cells. And that means that they can have direct effects. The water-soluble hormones, they can affect the receptor, but then the receptor has to affect the cell. These lipid derivative hormones down here, they can go right into the cell and make an effect all by themselves. So typically, the lipid derivative hormones, the effects are much more profound. So, for example, the reproductive system hormones are mostly of this steroid variety over here. I keep losing my pointer over here. And at puberty, obviously there are massive changes that affect many of the cells of the body. Well, that's an example of the kind of power that these lipid derivative hormones can do, because they can go into the nucleus and turn genes on or off. So these steroid hormones can literally transform a cell of one type into a cell of another by turning different genes on or off and changing that cell into something else. Okay? So all of the chemical messengers that we're going to hear about in this chapter and then in subsequent chapters, they all three fall into one of these three categories, right? And one of these subcategories. So either eicosanoids or steroids for the lipids. The peptide hormones, there aren't categories that are important really. And then the amino acid derivatives, we've got the thyroid hormones, the catecholamines, and then the tryptophan derivatives like melatonin. All right. So those are the messengers. These are the messages and their envelopes, essentially, right? And we're going to talk here in a little bit about the mailbox. If one organ is going to send a message to another, well, first it has to write the message, right? That's these guys. That's these molecules. But then that message has to be received, and the cell has to do something about it. So we'll see how that works in the receptor stuff here in a minute. So in the endocrine system, we have two sets of organs. We've got the primary endocrine organs. What that means is their principal job in the body is to produce hormones. That's all they do. They don't really do anything else. And then we have the other organs that do something else principally, but also release some hormones of their own. We're not going to talk about this set in this chapter, because these we're going to get to as we get to these different organs. So when we talk about the heart, we'll talk about some of the heart hormones and so on for the rest of these. But in this chapter, we focus on the glands. You know, a gland is an organ that secretes something. It produces it and secretes it, either onto a body surface, you know, like a sweat gland is an example of a gland, into a body cavity, like the pancreas is a gland that produces digestive enzymes for the small intestine. And then we have our endocrine glands, which are these guys. They produce hormones that go into the blood that are then carried by the blood to the different cells to turn activities on and off, so to speak. All right, so we're going to hit each of these. The hypothalamus is really part of the brain. It's sort of half brain, half gland, and it's where the brain meets the rest of the endocrine system. So instead of neural activity, the hypothalamus turns neural activity into chemical messenger activity, and then that makes everything else happen, as we'll see as we go. Just underneath the hypothalamus in the brain is the pituitary gland. And if the hypothalamus is like the boss, it's like the CEO, right? The pituitary gland is like your manager. It's actually going to take those messages from the boss and get things done with them, okay? So there's a whole bunch of different pituitary gland hormones that we'll cover probably next time, or we might start them today. Okay, then we get into the glands not found in the brain. So we've got the thyroid gland, which is here in the neck. Oh, let me turn this. So you got the thyroid gland in the neck, perhaps the most famous of all endocrine glands. Anybody in here have thyroid problems or know somebody who does? Yes, boom, boom, boom. It is also one of the glands that goes wrong the most often. So of all the patients an endocrinologist sees, most of them are there because of thyroid problems. And we'll talk a little bit about why it's not the best gland when we get there. But so that's the thyroid here in the neck. Behind the thyroid gland are little round glands called the parathyroid glands, and they play a big role in calcium homeostasis. Okay, you may have heard about those when you talked about bone. Did you talk about calcitonin and parathyroid hormone last semester? No. Sounds like no. Okay, well, we're going to cover them now, so you'll get it. And, okay, so thyroid gland. The adrenal glands get their name because they sit on top of the kidneys. So odd is next to, renal is kidneys. So these are the odd renal glands, the glands next to the kidneys. They sit like little top hats on top of each kidney. And they, as we talked about in the sympathetic nervous system chapter, they release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. So they produce catecholamines, create that fight or flight response that we talked about last time, or last semester. The pancreas has two roles. One is as a digestive system gland. The other is as a gland that secretes hormones that affect our metabolism, the most famous of which are going to be insulin and glucagon to control blood sugars. Some of you will have heard of one or both of those. The pineal gland, we already talked about it, secretes melatonin. And then, the parathyroid glands, we talked about those too. All right, so we're going to cover each of these glands in turn, but most of our time we're going to spend on these top two. The boss, the hypothalamus, and the manager, the pituitary gland. All right. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit about receptors. So you can think of a receptor as a mailbox or as an antenna or any other analogy that you choose. It sits there doing nothing until it's activated by something else. And in the endocrine system, that activation is going to be from a hormone. And I think you all talked about G proteins and second messengers last time. Yes? Okay, good. So this is going to be a bit of a review, this part is. So essentially, a second messenger is like a relay. So the message gets to one part of the cell, and then that cell creates a second message that goes into some other part of the cell to make an effect. Okay? One of the reasons why these exist is because these chemical messengers can't cross the cell membrane. So we got to have some other mechanism for getting this information from out here into there. So there's a couple of different systems of second messengers. These are the two most common by a landslide, right? Okay, so here's our cell membrane. Here's our receptor. Here's our chemical messenger. So why the funny shapes? Molecules have shapes, and in biology, the shape of molecules is usually the most important piece, at least at the cell membrane, because it allows a receptor to have a complementary shape to a messenger, and they click together. And when they click together, there's chemistry that changes. So the whole receptor changes its shape, and then that triggers some response on the inside. Proteins are like machines like that. You know, when you push the key on a typewriter or on a computer keyboard, you know, it changes shape, right? It moves, and by changing shape, it moves the little switch underneath, and A pops up on your screen, right? Proteins are a lot like that. They change their shape and make something happen, okay? So one of the methods that it does that is by using what's called a G protein. So here we've got a receptor. Here we've got a G protein that's sort of attached to it. When the hormone clicks in, the G protein goes from inactive to active. Why do we care? Because G proteins can make things happen on the inside of cells, which is going to make this attachment create a change on the inside. All right, so 2 examples of what G proteins can do. One has to do with cyclic AMP. All right, so ATP, you've heard about, adenosine triphosphate, right? If you lop off 2 phosphate groups from that, you get an AMP, an adenosine monophosphate, which is kind of a funny molecule because you can take it and you can bend it into a circle, you can click the 2 ends together, and you make cyclic AMP. Okay, so you'd imagine, because ATP is so important, there's always going to be AMP around, because there is always ADP and ATP around. So here we take this compound that's ever present in the cell, it's everywhere, and by flipping it into a circle, we can use that to send a signal from the outside of the cell to the inside of the cell. So this can either turn cyclic AMP levels up or down, depending on the receptor and the G protein that are activated. So we'll talk about the increase first, the stimulation. Okay, so hormone clicks in, that turns on the G protein. That G protein takes an ATP, bends it in a circle, makes a cyclic AMP. Now, depending on the cell, what happens next, it depends on what kind of cell it is. But for example, as cyclic AMP levels go up, it might cause ion channels to open. From your work with muscle and nerve last semester, you know when ion channels open, big things happen, right? Membrane potential changes, action potentials happen. So that's a big event for the cell, triggered because of this hormone that popped onto this receptor out here. Cyclic AMP can also turn enzymes on and off. So let's say in the liver, you know, you need to go from spending glucose to making glucose. Well, insulin attaches, causes this G protein to activate, cyclic AMP levels go up, and different enzymes turn on to make the liver behave differently in response to that hormone. Now, the G protein can do the reverse too. Not the same one, but in a different cell with a different hormone, let's say, we can have the reverse effect, where cyclic AMP is destroyed and unbroken out of the circle, turn into AMP, and it has maybe the opposite effect that we saw here. So hormones can both turn things up or turn things down, just like you saw with neurotransmitters. You know, there are stimulatory ones and inhibitory ones. And by having both in the body, it means that we can really carefully narrow the range of what we want a cell to do, right? Because we've got to stop that and we've got to do more of that, and they push on each other so we can have a very stable level. All right, so that's cyclic AMP G protein related second messenger, okay? Another second messenger is calcium, and calcium can either be a second messenger in lots of different ways. I may have mentioned last semester that calcium is one of the ions in the body. When you see it in a description of something, pay attention, because calcium does some of the coolest stuff that the body does. Not all by itself, but it's like the trigger for some of the fanciest mammal stuff we do. So for example, without calcium, there is no nerve transduction. In other words, the neurotransmitter never gets released. So that's no brain is working. Calcium causes skeletal muscle to contract. We heard lots and lots about that, right? Calcium is necessary for the heart to contract. Calcium is necessary for smooth muscle to contract. So calcium makes things happen, okay? And here it's being used as a second messenger. All right, so here, hormone clicks on, G protein activates, and we can have one or more things that happen. So let's say in a skeletal muscle cell, that G protein activation causes the release of calcium from the endoplasmic reticulum, or the sarcoplasmic reticulum, you may have heard it called that. And that in turn causes calcium levels in the cell to go up, and something happens. You know, it may be skeletal muscle contraction, it may be activation of enzymes, or whatever calcium is doing inside that cell. G proteins can also trigger the opening of calcium channels on the cell membrane too. So now we have a double effect. It's being released from the inside, and calcium is coming in from the outside, so we're going to have something happen. You know, this example would fit perfectly with a cardiac contraction. You know, calcium comes in from the outside and from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and it causes those sarcomeres to shorten, and lo and behold, the heart contracts, which is exactly what we want it to do. So this is just two examples of second messengers. In advanced molecular biology and biochemistry, there's a gazillion examples of these. But cyclic AMP and calcium are two major players we're going to see at our level as we go through here. Now, you would only see either of these with our lipid-soluble chemical messenger. So either the amino acid derivatives or the peptide hormones from our list, from this list, right? These two, you're going to see second messenger systems. All right? All right. The steroid hormones, though, remember, they can pass through cell membranes, which means they have another trick that they can do. So here's the steroid hormone. It's lipid soluble, so whoop, right through the cell membrane. No receptor, no hole required, no transporter, no nothing. It can just go right on through. And then it can either go to two places. You can have a receptor in the cytoplasm, so we have that happen with steroid hormones. Or you can have a receptor all the way in the nucleus that's basically going to activate or deactivate a set of DNA, a gene. So it's going to turn a gene on, turn a gene off, or up or down. So these steroid hormones, the system is much less elaborate because they can pass right through the cell membrane and through the nuclear membrane too. So, you know, we turn on a gene, that causes a protein to be produced, and that protein production then creates some alteration of what that cell does. Yeah.
So since it doesn't have receptors on the cell, does that mean that it affects every cell that it comes in contact with? Or?
It will be in every cell it comes in contact with, but the cell still has to have a receptor on the inside for it to do anything. So like the steroid hormone can't directly change the DNA, it needs a tool for that. So the cell has to have the right tool to make that change, but that's a very good question. But you do find it in all cells, even if it's not doing anything, because it can pass in and out. All right. And then sort of the weird one out that we have to talk about because it's the thyroid gland. Thyroid hormone is a water-soluble hormone, but it's because of its ionic characteristics, it too can get into the cell membrane, but it needs a transporter for that. Okay, so, and we don't talk about the transporter, but the receptors for thyroid hormone are not found on the surface of the cell, like we have for most water-soluble messengers. Instead, they're found directly on the mitochondria, or in the nucleus, or in the cytoplasm somewhere else. So, you know, the mitochondria in many ways is like a separate organism. I don't know if you talked about it like that or not, but, you know, the mitochondria probably evolutionarily was a bacteria billion years ago that took up residence in certain cells. And because they produce energy so effectively, those cells did better. So they're still in all of us today, you know, these mitochondria. So just like cells, mitochondria have DNA, mitochondria have receptors, mitochondria have their whole other thing going on. You know, it's like they're a little independent thing inside the cell. And one example of that is the mitochondria have thyroid hormone receptors. And if you remember that thyroid hormone turns metabolism up or down, that kind of makes sense, because where is most of our energy metabolism happening? Well, it's happening in the mitochondria. So we have this direct communication between the thyroid gland and all the mitochondria of the body. All right. And then just like a steroid hormone, thyroid hormone receptors are also found on the inside of the nucleus as well, where they too can turn genes on and off. can create changes in the proteins that the cell produces, and therefore what it does when it's sitting there. All right, so those are sort of the three systems. We've got second messenger systems, cyclic AMP up or down, calcium up. It can also be calcium down, but that one's much more uncommon. We've got the steroid mechanism, which is either in the cytoplasm or in the nucleus, and then the thyroid hormone mechanism, which is on the inside of cells. And its big thing is increased ATP production or turning genes on and off, very similar to a steroid hormone. All right. I thought we had some questions here. I guess we don't. I wonder if I took them out. All right. So, questions about any of that before we get on to the hypothalamus? Well, I'm going to turn these lights back on because I'm seeing some sleepy faces. Melatonin and light are directly affected. The darker the room, the melatonin production goes up, and you get a little sleepy, and your learning starts to fall off. All right, so questions about the chemical messengers or their receptors. Okay. In some ways, I think this chapter is laid out in the book backwards because we talk about the messengers before we talk about what they're going to do and where they come from, but that's how they laid it out, and it works just fine. So you've got these groups of chemical messengers, you've got these different kinds of receptors, and you'll see a little bit about how they work as we give some examples. Okay, so now we're going to zoom away from the cell membrane, giant cell membrane, which is very, very close to the cell, and we're going to zoom out where stuff we can see again. Okay, so the beginning or the master part of the did turn that down anyway, of the endocrine system sits here at the base of the brain, this funny little shape right here. So here's the cerebral cortex, right? Here's the corpus callosum. Here's the cerebellum. Here's the brainstem. Well, sort of in the front and middle is this funny-looking section, and we call that the hypothalamus. And in the hypothalamus, we have a set of neurons whose primary role is to control this chemical messenger system. Okay, so we have here in purple are the where the regulatory hormones come from. So this area of the brain controls this area, which is the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland hangs down from the base of the brain. That's this guy right here. Do you remember the sella turcica from looking at the skull? In lab, you probably saw it. It's this Turkish saddle. You know, the inside of the skull looks like some little man could sit there. Well, inside that sella turcica is where the pituitary gland lives, right? So it sits deep in the brain. It's surrounded by bone on 3.5 sides. So it's in one of the most protected places in the body. And its primary role is to take instructions from the hypothalamus and convert them into a language that the glands can understand, okay? So the three mechanisms by which the hypothalamus controls the rest of the endocrine system are listed here. Okay, so one is by hormones being released. Part of the hypothalamus releases hormones in tiny little amounts. Those tiny little amounts go directly to the pituitary gland, and then the hypothalamus hormones cause the pituitary hormones to be released, different ones to be released. Okay, so chemicals from here go to here. Another is direct neural control. So there are cell bodies, they're in green here, at this part of the hypothalamus, whose axons reach down the stalk of the pituitary and to the back half of the pituitary gland, where they directly release hormones. So that's ADH and oxytocin, which we'll talk more about the mechanism when we get there. And then the third way is through the sympathetic nervous system. So mountain lion jumps in front of you, right? And the hypothalamus sends a signal through the spinal cord, out through the sympathetic chain, into the adrenal gland, where you release a huge amount of epinephrine and norepinephrine to prepare you to fight or flee and then survive at the end, hopefully. So those are the three ways the hypothalamus controls things: by chemical messages, by neural release, or by neural transduction out to the adrenal gland. So this one, we kind of don't talk much about in this chapter because we already did You know, in the sympathetic nervous system, I called the adrenal gland a sort of giant sympathetic neuron, and that's what it is. It's just instead of releasing its neurotransmitter into a synapse, it releases it into the bloodstream instead. So that's the first endocrine organ you actually saw. So we don't talk much about that piece. But these two pieces we will talk about. Okay. So the pituitary, which is down here, has a stalk, and that stalk we call the infundibulum, right? Great word. Too long for a Scrabble word unless you get lucky with fun or something. But infundibulum is the stalk. Pituitary is down here. This region is also called the hypophysis. So you know how anatomy is. Sometimes over time there gets to be more than one name. All right, so you know, here's the brain, right? I told you I was a bad artist. There's the cerebellum. And then you have this little stalk that hangs down. Totally not to scale, incidentally, because the pituitary is about the size of a good size pea, right? So it's a little tiny thing. So this is the infundibulum. And this is, in America, we usually call it the pituitary. But in other parts of the world, and sometimes even in this country, we call it the hypophysis. Not to be confused with it sounded like cousin hypothesis, right? A hypothesis is part of the scientific method. A hypothesis is another name for the pituitary gland, right? Okay. All right. And this will be our last topic for the day. Okay, so if we zoom in and we add a little more detail to that. Okay, so we've taken this part away, and we're going to zoom in right to here. Okay, so here's the hypothalamus. Here is that infundibulum, the stalk, right? And here is the pituitary gland, also called the hypophysis, which is where we get this name from. And we get to see our first, where's the eraser? Here it is. Of course, it's in the middle. All right. We see our first portal system. We're going to see 3 of them in this semester together. We're going to see one here, we're going to see one in the liver, and then we're going to see our third one in the kidney. So you're asking yourself, I'm sure, Dr. Keith, what is a portal system? Well, a portal system is an arrangement of blood flow. Okay, typically, when you go from heart to body and back to heart, you pass through one capillary bed, right? You go from heart to capillary bed and then back to heart again, right? So I draw it like this. This is what it's supposed to look like. Because in a capillary bed, you get these lots of little vessels that spread out, right? Then they come back together as veins. So this is the normal case. So heart, I'm going to say CB for capillary bed, back to heart. In a portal system, you have 2 capillary beds between heart and back to heart. So this is our first example of this. So let me show you. We start here. So see that superior hypophyseal artery? That's blood coming from the heart. Well, that blood passes into the hypothalamus. See how it spreads out into lots of little vessels? So this is a capillary bed right here. Those capillaries come back together to form just a couple of channels. They go down into the pituitary or hypophysis, and then they spread out again into a second capillary bed. We see that? So here's one, here's another. That makes this a portal system. This blood is going from heart to capillary bed number 1, capillary bed number 2, and before it goes back to the heart. Now, who cares? This is a little tiny structure. You know, you're talking about less than 5-6 millimeters here. It's part of how this system works. Remember, the hypothalamus, one of the ways it controls the endocrine system, this purple way right here, is by releasing chemical messengers. Well, chemical messengers need blood in order to move from place to place. So the first capillary bed gathers up the chemical messengers from the hypothalamus here, carries those messages to the pituitary, and then the pituitary uses those messages to create additional messages that go out to the body. So this hypophyseal portal system, this two capillaries between artery and back to the heart, is responsible for carrying those control hormones, which are called releasing hormones, from the hypothalamus down to the pituitary where they can actually do something. All right? So it's our first portal system that's called the hypophyseal portal system. It carries messages from here to here. Okay. Now, you'll see, just like you saw in the last picture, the pituitary looks different in the front than it does in the back. So this is the front. That's front in our picture. Okay. The anterior pituitary is a gland that responds to releasing hormones from the hypothalamus. The posterior pituitary, see how it looks, it's drawn differently in a different color with different texture. The posterior hypophysis or posterior pituitary is all nerve tissue, okay? And the nerve tissue that it is, it's the axons of cell bodies that are found up here in the hypothalamus, and those axons release only two, hormones that affect the body, and that is oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, which we'll talk much more about those later. The one that some of you may have heard of, which is oxytocin, it has a number of different roles in the body, but one that sort of people end up knowing about, I think, oxytocin causes letdown in breastfeeding. So when baby starts to feed, the milk starts to get pushed out towards the baby. Well, the hormone that causes that pushing out of the milk comes right from these axons, oxytocin. And it's in response to neural activity. So a mom who's unconscious, let's say, she may not have letdown because there's no neural stimulation to cause that oxytocin to be released and for the milk to be pushed out from mom. So we're going to talk more about that later. But that's where we'll end for today because we're out of time. And we'll finish talking about the pituitary next time and all of the wondrous things that it does. All right, which will be Monday, I guess. Questions before you all leave?